Hey there, guys. All right, today we are back with some more overly sarcastic productions. We are hitting up another history summarize, this time the Viking Age. I don't think I've watched this one. I don't. Now, the track record with me actually reacting to the things I know very well tend to not get views, so we'll see how this one does. For those that may be new or unaware, because I think it's been a while since I've mentioned it really in any specificity. Um, I got my degree. Well, obviously, I got my degree in history, but specifically, I wrote my senior thesis on around the Viking Age time period, specifically the Anglo Saxons, and how specifically the thesis prompt that I went with was Wessex was able to be why Wessex was the only Anglo-Saxon kingdom capable of withstanding the Viking invasion. I think was ultimately what I went with. Been a couple years since I wrote it. But yeah, ultimately that piece turned more into a cultural thing in the beginnings of Anglification, uh, and nothing really about war. It was more like a policy kind of paper, not so much one on like you know nothing really about battles. I think I talked about maybe two battles. I think the Battle of Chippenham was like the only one. Was the big one. Um, and anyways, go ahead and just dive right in here.
The word Viking is immensely frustrating. Our grasp on the original etymology is tenuous at best, and Viking was barely even used to label the people who went out to sea. The Europeans on the receiving end of these spontaneous blade-wielding visitors called them Northmen, Danes, Rus, or simply those jerks.
Okay, so yes, fish. Um, Specifically, I'm going to talk about the terms Northmen and Danes. I've said this in other videos on other reactions on in regards to videos about the Viking Age. Um, in regards to the Anglo-Saxons, there was from what I can tell, from the sources and the secondary sources that we write today, authors and people back then made the distinction between Northmen and Danes. There was a difference. Northmen was referencing Swedes and Norwegians, probably most likely Norwegians, um, and then or Norse. Norse would refer to Norwegians and Swedes. Danes specifically went to the Danish, modern day Danish people, where they were from. But back then, those kind of Danes would also fill up like what is today southern Sweden. I think this is called, is that Scandia? Is that the name of the territory? Can't remember. Um, but yeah, the Danes would be modern day Danish. Norsemen, they'd be the Norwegians and things. There was a distinction. It wasn't just like a broad term. From what I saw when I was doing my research like 2 years ago now, um, it was very much there seemed to be even by contemporaries they didn't just broad term them. They did not like refer to Danes as the Norsemen, things like that. They would call them like the pagans, and pagans would be probably the most broad term for them. But like Danes and Northmen were more specific terminology.
Who trashed our
That makes
monastery.
sense.
And the Scandinavians behind this violent tourism didn't really tell us what they called themselves, because our first good records from them don't show up until centuries later. But history is 20% iffy nomenclature by mass, and the name has since stuck.
I mean, it's a good name too. Also, Assassin's Creed Valhalla. It's funny. Not a. I mean, it's decent. I think for the Vikings. I'm just gonna use the term Vikings because it honestly really doesn't matter. It is such an accepted term. Like if we want to be, if I were writing a historical paper here, I would be more specific and not using the terminology Viking, but I'm not. We're being casual here. Okay, I'm gonna call them Vikings. Um, Assassin's Creed Valhalla got um Alfred the Great pretty damn good. Um, but the Vikings that they were like focusing on, I feel like is probably the part that they messed up the most. I'm not, but again, it is also hard to really get a good feel for Viking culture because, or well, know what the Vikings were really like. Because again, they didn't write stuff down. What we've got are stuff that maybe survived through oral stories, things we've dug up, and then the stuff written centuries after the Viking Age came to an end. And then, of course, we have the outsider perspectives from like the Anglo Saxons, the Franks, and Mediterranean people. So, yeah.
Still, though,
But also, Assassin's Creed Valhalla, I thought it was okay. I think I give it like a 7 or a 6 out of 10 looking back on it. Um, I think probably closer to a 6 looking back on it just because it is filled with so much things that are ultimately kind of feel meaningless. Um, the side and like the story, the stuff with Alfred the Great, I thought was the best of that game. So, yeah.
even our modern usage is problematic because the term often gets applied as a catch-all for medieval Scandinavia when its meaning is rather narrow. Viking is the act and associated profession of raiding, just being a pirate. Vikings themselves
Yar.
were a small subset of Scandinavians, but their historical impact and overwhelming cool factor earned them top billing in medieval history. So although Scandinavian does not by default equal Viking, we can describe their collective ventures under the banner of the Viking Age.
So yes, it was a subsect of the population. However, during the Viking Age, there are a few reasons. There are some things to mention. Um, to be more specific here, the reason why there started being a ton more Vikings and why the Viking Age really began are a couple reasons. The two biggest ones that I remember seeing, uh, as from secondary sources saying these were like the bigger reasons, the more likely plausible ones. Overpopulation in Scandinavia because they also don't have much farming land, right? Like when we look at Norway, look at all those mountains, and not much farming land, and also Denmark is small, right? Sweden's got a good bit more farming land, but again, not much. So overpopulation is one reason. Couple that with so the leaders of these Viking parties would be nobles from the Viking clans, tribes, whatever, blah blah blah, and so they would be like the captains of the ships. The reason they were there isn't because like they were the leaders of their hometown or whatever, right? They weren't the lord. They were like the lord's third or fourth brother or something like that. They were a distant family that instead of so for Norse tradition, it's somewhat similar to how the Welsh did it, where it would be the land would split amongst like all of the sons like equally or something like that. And largely this is people I've seen this kind of attributed to why the Welsh were incapable of fighting off the English because the Welsh continued like dividing their land with each passing generation and never really did anything about it, so they could never truly properly unify because then those familial rivalries began because one brother or one sibling wanted it all. Actually, I think the Welsh were even they gave land to like all like when they died it would go to like all of their living relations, I think was how it went. Like it really got divided or something like that. Um I'm really rusty on the Welsh information though. But the Scandinavians, right? Instead, to avoid right dividing up the land further, they would instead like the younger brothers would just go on a Viking. They'd be ship captains, right? And they would give up their land in Scandinavia to then see and go and try and conquer land elsewhere. This is largely attributed to why um, there started to be more and more Vikings as the years went on into the from the 8th century into the ninth, and why we see in I think it's around 860 when the Scandinavians start to actually colonize and conquer the British Isles. That's so the shift is large. Yes. I went on a tangent. I don't know if I made any sense.
To find out how it all went down and to see just how ludicrously far these Norse boys got, let's do some history. In addition to a wibbly moniker, the Vikings are also a little fuzzy in the timeline department. For narrative convenience, historians often date the age from 793 to 1066, opening with the sack
Yep, I agree with that.
of Lindisfarne Monastery.
Yep, no, you will. That is pretty much undisputed. I'm just going to say that it's undisputed. The start of the Viking Age is the sacking of Lindisfarne. Yes. I mean, the Scandinavians had been raiding Russia for probably decades, if not centuries, by this point in time, right? Just because of proximity. But Lindisfarne Monastery was the first time really that they went, I think, west and really just started going for targets not around the Baltic.
And closing with the Norman conquest of England. But if Vikings are pirates, then their age should be thorough in its coverage of involuntary treasure reallocation. So really, we need to bump those numbers out by at least a few decades. Scandinavians were trading, seafaring, and occasionally plundering.
I would agree that perhaps the ending note of the Viking Age could be pushed back a bit because obviously the belief in pagan belief wasn't still like Lithuania didn't adopt Christianity statewide until what, the 1300s. So I think we could definitely push it back beyond 1066. But before the Lindisfarne Monastery, I could understand maybe not wanting to do the Lindisfarne Monastery raid because it's a very Anglo-centric kind of way of putting the timeline, which, you know, some people don't like. It's totally reasonable if people won't like that. So I can understand maybe wanting to push that as well. But notable, sizable raids outside like of this region, Lindisfarne is the only one that I know of. Like the first one that I know of that is the Vikings going into Western Europe and doing that shit.
Long before Lindisfarne. It's always tempting to imagine a culture just kind of appearing onto history as a fully formed entity, but Scandinavia had several Viking traits from early on, and the society gradually evolved through the first millennium AD. Trade networks in the Iron Age reached into the Celtic and Roman worlds, and the maritime culture was already fairly robust. Scandinavia was a tough place to traverse, as inland areas were either full of trees or covered in mountains, so people and supplies had to travel by water if they wanted to get anywhere. Luckily, these guys had trees for days, so they became wizards at woodworking and shipbuilding. With the convenient training zone of the enclosed Baltic Sea...
I know that ship.
Scandinavians developed a truly...
Hold on, is that the ship I'm thinking of? Is this the Viking ship that was made for the Chicago World Fair in the early 1900s? That was then sailed across the Atlantic to prove that Leif Erikson was able to do it. If that's the ship, I've seen the ship in person.
Brilliant ship design, using an overlapping plank construction on a long, narrow, and shallow hull. This meant that ships could sail the open sea and row along rivers, which, to the delight of Scandinavians and the abject terror of Europeans, will make the Vikings quite versatile travelers. While Scandinavia was outclassing the rest of the world in the seafaring skill tree, their land situation differed from Europe's post-Roman migratory reshuffle. Instead of kingdoms full of cities and shiny monasteries, Scandinavians lived on small farmsteads and had no overarching government. But who needs government when you have a boat full of warriors in the favor of Thor? So, by the 700s, Scandinavians were becoming familiar with the wider European world, sailing eastwards in the Baltic and hopping westwards to the Frisian coast. This trading was sometimes a little aggressive, on the order of buy these furs or so help me Tyr, I will axe you. But that's just piracy for you, and it worked out decently well. However, the Vikings set themselves apart by just going for it. Northern Europe and the British Isles happened to have some shiny monasteries stacked with treasure and utterly lacking any defenses, because who would be so craven as to plunder a monastery? Well, that Pollyanna delusion shattered like a stained glass window when the Vikings rolled up to the British island of Lindisfarne in 793 and trampled the place, stealing the artifacts and selling the monks they didn't kill into slavery. Because, as they soon found out, the Muslim world was incalculably rich and had a substantial market for slave imports. Christians weren't supposed to be in the slaving business, but the markets in Frisia, Rome, Venice, and Constantinople clearly weren't losing any sleep about it. Oh, Cleo, what are you meowing about? I know, slavery's bad. Come here. Come here. Oh, good cat, good cat. Who's a little floofy boot?
I approve the cat break.
So the Vikings of the early 800s enjoyed...
Okay, one interesting thing about the Viking raids on monasteries, what it also caused within Britain, was nearly the destruction of Christianity in Britain. Monasteries, no one wanted to work in a monastery. No one wanted to be a monk anymore because they were so unsafe. And for a time before the Viking, if I'm remembering this right, before the Viking Age, Britain was the largest, I think, was where everything was being written. A bunch of stuff was being written inside the monasteries of Britain. And then because of the Viking Age, Vikings and stuff in their raids, we started losing a lot of that stuff really fucking quickly, and it wasn't getting replaced, and no one was wanting to keep writing, right? So we see literacy rates plummet in the 800s. And of course, the Franks have a big market in the monastery writing, scripting stuff. Right? They kept it alive. The Franks kept it alive. Mainland Europe and stuff, like Franks, Italy, Greece, stuff like that, kept it alive. But inside of Britain, it was nearly just wiped away because the Vikings were that detrimental, and the Anglo-Saxon monarchs could not protect the monasteries. They did not have the means to do it until Alfred the Great started, doing his thing in the 870s and 880s. And he also brought about the revival of literacy in England. And then also starts to bring it up to compete back again with the Frankish production rate. I'm definitely over summarizing that as well, and it is probably factually wrong in a couple places, but you get the vibe.
A stunningly efficient business model. Sale, sack, steal, sell, celebrate. And the Europeans were horrified. This, dear viewer, is why some of our sources for the Vikings are so uniquely screwy. Scandinavians left some inscriptions on runestones but otherwise didn't write anything about themselves during the Viking Age, so our documentation comes from the people who lived in constant fear of being waylaid by a surprise fleet of longships. Now, as a human with functional empathy, it's obvious why these accounts are so biased, but as a historian who wishes we understood the Vikings a little bit better, it does me a big sad. We do eventually get Scandinavian sources on their history and culture, but they're about 3 centuries late and were all written post-Christianization, so we're 0 for 2 on original Norse works. And this is where archaeology especially has come in clutch for us, because settlement remains and burial patterns across Europe have been doing the heavy lifting in recent scholarship. As it happens, our newest discoveries are coming from Eastern Europe, which had long been sidelined in the Viking narrative and wasn't accessible to research because of that pesky Iron Curtain. Yeah, I know, there were bigger problems in the 20th century, but Viking stuff, man, come on. Anyway, the earliest evidence we have for the old raid-and trade routine comes from the system of waterways running from the Baltic down the Volga and to the Caspian Sea. The swindle here wasn't in sacking monasteries, because there weren't any, but in trading furs, lumber, amber, and wool, plus capturing local Slavic people and selling them into slavery. The morality of that last operation was rather bankrupt, but the economics were quite the opposite. The only problem is Vikings had to work with middlemen in the Bulgar and Khazar Khaganates. So in the mid-800s, they bopped westwards away from the Volga River and onto the Dnieper. This route fed into the Black Sea and landed them right on the doorstep of the biggest and shiniest city in the Christian world, Constantinople. This being the Vikings, they tried to sack it, but the Byzantines had the benefit of actual defenses and were able to hold out just fine. They did, however, become fascinated by the Vikings, whom they called Varangians, and hired some for the emperor's personal guard. Scandinavians were thrilled to deal directly with with Constantinople and built up trading towns along the Dnieper River, such as Kiev. The demographics at work here are a little murky because it seems like the Scandinavians of the so-called Rus became a minority population among the native Slavs and Finns, but research is ongoing. To the collective thrill of the Byzantine Empire, the Rus adopted Orthodox Christianity in 989, and this becomes a running plotline elsewhere in Europe. So let's jump west and look at the Carolingian Empire. After some raiding in the early 800s, the Vikings figure out that they can make significantly more cash from gently sacking a place and then ransoming the loot and captives back to the locals. They also start exploiting entire cities for payment of Danegeld in exchange for not attacking. This process was made significantly
in the years after the death of Louis the Pious, Francia splits among his three sons. It's a whole mess.
Easier by the near constant civil warring between the three Frankish kingdoms after its partition in 840, so there was zero coordinated resistance to the raids. By 865, the Vikings had cleared out Central Europe a little too well, so many hopped the channel to go bother the
no, they actually didn't really clear out Francia. It's because Francia actually developed a means of defense, much like the Byzantines. Now they didn't have, Greek fire and things like that, but they had essentially a standing army of like cavalry that could like essentially move quickly to deal with and respond quickly to the Vikings. And they would also largely just pay off the Vikings and get them the fuck off. And then of course later, I can't remember when it happens, but like, we have the deal with the Viking leader Rollo, who becomes the first like Norman Duke of Normandy, and he ancestor to William the Conqueror, blah blah blah. That essentially keeps the Vikings away from raiding Central Europe. So now they got to go somewhere else, and they go to England, which is fractured even more than Western Europe here, and they make a bunch of fucking money. And the English kings are paying them off when they can, and then the Vikings are just coming back a few like months later and sacking them again, demanding more Danegeld. And yeah.
Isles instead. We'll go ravage England in a second, don't you worry, but at the turn of the 10th century, our beloved Northmen doubled back over to France, and the Frankish king was flat broke, so he paid them off with land. The Vikings gained the county of Rouen, which was
that was in 911. Okay.
Later promoted to the Duchy of Normandy. This was great for everyone because the Vikings stopped sailing down the Seine to make a mess in Paris, and the newly settled Normans got comfy in their new digs, speaking French, adopting Christianity, and cooperating with the church administration to more effectively govern. The Normans quickly stop acting like your typical Vikings and go off on their own historical trajectory, but safe to say they become a big deal. Okay, so now let's destroy the British Isles. In the early 800s, they were prime targets. Kingdoms were small and weak, and Irish monks prepared a buffet of beautifully sackable monasteries. We had the standard Viking playbook until 865, when the Great Army arrived from Francia, Denmark, and Norway to absolutely wreck shop. In the span of a few years, a Scandinavian army makes a base in East Anglia, marches north to conquer York and the Kingdom of Northumbria, swoops down to take half of Mercia, and loops back over to East Anglia to make it over half of the Saxon kingdom stomped, the only full survivor being Wessex. Unlike in Normandy, the Vikings weren't able to establish a proper state, but
Nope, hold on. You can't just give me... Depends somewhat on your definition. Scandinavians took over many of the pre-existing mechanisms of power from local kings and lords, but they didn't create a central or overarching system. Scandinavian contributions to England were cultural, linguistic, and legal, not political. A little unfair of me to judge their instant statehood right after an insane feat of conquest, but this does explain in part why the Danelaw would become a bit short-lived. Yes and no. I mean, essentially, it's kind of like they essentially made puppets. They were like, hey, we will install you as Lord, but do what we say, kind of sort of deal. They very much played like, I guess the Game of Thrones. You could say they would see like a civil war, like in regards to Northumbria, when they came in and conquered, there was a civil war happening in Northumbria. They sided with one of them, the guy that was the person, whoever that would like do what they wanted. They sided with that one and helped him win the throne. That's essentially how the Danelaw came to be. That's essentially what they would do. But yeah, they wouldn't they didn't necessarily outright govern the land that they conquered, at least not right away. I think they started to towards the end of their existence, towards the end of the Danelaws' existence, they would start to actually govern it. I think more directly, I believe. Again, really hazy on this information because it wasn't what I focused on my thesis, governance and things like that. And again, only really focused on the Wessex side. But like when Edward the Elder started coming in and finishing off his father's work, and then after Edward the Elder, Athelstan comes in and unites England, becomes the first true king of England. I would say around then the Danelaw started to shift and be more of a governing body and things like that.
But they did set the rulebook for this big new land, so we call it the Danelaw. Meanwhile, back in Wessex, King Alfred knew that it was nut up or shut up, so he reformed his state to meet the Scandinavian threat, and his successors later conquered up to create the Kingdom of England. And the Anglo-Danish hybrid culture in the north seemed pretty chill with the arrangement, what with all the easily arable land and good royal administration. Then there's Ireland, which didn't end up being a place where Scandinavians came to live, but it did become the money pot of the Viking world. Because after they cleaned out the countless monasteries, they built up coastal merchant towns at the bases of rivers to raid inland for slaves to sell at markets in Spain. Of course, they raided some Iberian towns along the way, but what did you expect? Norse settlers had more long-term luck in the wider Celtic world, like the Isle of Man, the Hebrides, Orkneys, Shetlands, and lowland Scotland. But if we want to talk about settlement colonization, we've got to go off the edge of the known world for the A-tier Viking accomplishment. Iceland. Situated smack in the middle of the North Atlantic, Iceland is a little out of the way and seems to have been discovered by accident. When some poor sailors overshot the Faroe Islands and presumably freaked the hell out when they discovered a giant uninhabited island about 2 postcodes out from Niflheim. Setting aside the non-zero chance of veering wildly off course while sailing over, it's easy to see why Iceland instantly became prime real estate. Tons of good land, no locals to fight, and the Valkyries put on a light show every winter. Dinner and a show, what else do you need? After Iceland's discovery in the 870s-ish, fleets of Norwegians sail in to settle and create a quasi-democratic island assembly. As centuries go by, it remains a fairly insular corner of the Scandinavian world, and the old oral storytelling tradition gets put to writing, resulting in one of the most stacked literary cultures anywhere. The myths and historical sagas that we have aren't perfect, history is embellished, and mythology is through a post-Christian lens, but they're still the source for our understanding of Viking Age culture. So, as we've seen, the Scandinavian diaspora covered pretty much everywhere, but the Viking Age itself eventually...
And we didn't even cover, the stuff, their raids in, like, the Mediterranean.
...actually wrapped up.
Hey, Blue, this next part is insanely complicated. Mind if I step in?
Oh my word! Friend of the channel, Yellow aka Ludo History.
That's me.
You, my good sir, have 2 whole degrees in this field, which means on average, we each have 1 degree in this field.
That's definitely not how math works.
Oh, I studied classics. Red's the one with the math degree.
Don't you dare bring me into this.
Yellow, why don't you take it from here?
So, Christianity was interacting in much more interesting ways than mere victimhood in the Viking Age. It's not like Norse people had no clue what this Christianity was. Traders had been marked with the sign of the cross from early on, full-scale missionary attempts had happened as early as the 820s, and raiders in Europe would convert, sometimes even voluntarily. But the big wave of conversions among the Scandinavian elite happens in the late 10th century. Now, you'd think this would stop raids, but you'd be wrong. Knutor the Great was baptized in 1014, and he gets the distinction of most successful Viking, actually becoming King of England in 1016. And heck, the patron saint of Norway was a mercenary and raider in England in the 1010s too. So you can't exactly call conversion an ending. Christianity's link to the end of the Viking Age is even more tenuous in the Baltic. Sweden and Denmark kept raiding there well into the 12th century, though they eventually justified it as a crusade. What Christianity did do is let local leaders use Christian models and tools, such as the tithe, to justify and consolidate their power. Doing so allowed for more centralization than was possible before, and models of sacral kingship assisted in state building in Scandinavia and the formation of the countries into very roughly the shapes they have today. This is a slow process though, and it wasn't like 1066 hit and they went, ding, we're now well-behaved Christian kingdoms. In fact, I'm running out of time.
I'm not reading that.
Phew, nailed it.
Whoopsies, that's the late medieval alarm, which means that if we go any further, I'm gonna start compulsively talking about Florence, so let's wrap it up here. Thanks so much for stopping by, Yellow. So it's clearly hard to put a firm end date on the Viking Age, because the methods, motivations, and goals all changed during that time. But 1066 does have a nice irony to it. King Harald of Norway tried to conquer England using some classic great army tactics, but was defeated in battle. But then 1 month later, Duke William of Normandy led an army of knights at Hastings and won himself a kingdom. The Scandinavians who played by the old rules were left out in the cold, and the Scandinavians who adapted to their new homes and to changing worlds did a lot better for themselves. So, all told, the Viking Age is a class above simple piracy because it effectively terraformed the landscape of European politics, economics, and culture. And though their legacy has been appropriated in ways ranging from dubious to flat-out dangerous, the Viking Age proves that history only gets cooler the more we learn about it. Thank you so much for...
And that was History Summarized, the Viking Age. Yellow was a bit... I don't know if quiet is the right word. The mic was loud, but Yellow's voice was quiet. And also Yellow didn't, I feel like, wasn't enunciating quite well. Maybe this is like when Yellow was like super new or something. I don't know. Because usually, you know, I think there was a slight accent there. It sounded like there was. But usually accents aren't that, you know, they're not that detrimental to understanding people. It's just sometimes you got to take your time and listen. But because of the combination of the mic and them being a more, I guess they were very quiet to me and not enunciating clearly for me. I found it hard to really follow exactly what they were saying. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed. This ended up being longer than I thought it would be. I didn't think I would go on my Viking tangents, but I did. I hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.